Welcome back to Kapowich on Real Estate. This is a program dedicated to consumer protection within the residential real estate arena. So it's about time we did a program on pocket listings, also known as Off-MLS Listings. And I understand, Jim, back east they call it Whisper Listings. Whisper
right.
Listings. So we have Jim Harrison from MLSlistings.com, CEO. Welcome.
Thank you.
And of course our old friend Tony Ventura, real estate attorney, is a regular guest here on the program. Tony?
Glad to be back.
So, of course, I was at the convention, National Association of Realtor Convention, and your chairman was one of the main speakers on this topic on pocket listings, as well as the chief attorney for the California Association of Realtors.
That's true.
Now, I understand we really drove the boat here in California about this issue. Can you please describe what is a pocket listing and how is it a problem?
Well, so we've been analyzing, market activity for quite a while, and in a multiple listings service, it's mandatory submission of your listings when you get one. But if your seller chooses to exclude the property from the MLS, they can do that. It's their decision. There's a form for that, and we've been tracking those forms. And about 3 years ago, we started hearing quite a buzz and a lot of complaints from subscribers about listings being marketed outside of the MLS system. And so as we analyzed it further and further and further, and this was kind of a grassroots thing that our subscribers asked us to investigate, the term pocket listing came up. And it's an old term, that pocket listings have been around forever. But today, these are not really in your pocket. These listings are not in your pocket where you decide who you're going to cooperate with to sell your client's property. They're just off the MLS system. They're being marketed, but they're just not being marketed in the MLS.
Okay, now for the lay people, the multiple listing service, MLS stands for multiple listing service, and as a realtor, the code of ethics is over 100 years old now. So it was considered ethical that if I have a listing, which is a house for sale, I put it on the multiple listing service. And Tony, maybe you could speak about my duty, my fiduciary duty to my seller to do what's best for the seller and his or her family.
Well, under California law, real estate agents have the highest duty under the law to their sellers. In this case, the case we're talking about with listings, and it's phrased as the highest good faith, utmost loyalty and integrity, those types of words. And it's, essentially the most important thing to understand is it's the highest level of duty you have, where as a listing agent, you have to put the interest of your seller essentially above your own interest. And the way that's interpreted is your job is to get the highest, best offer for the sale of the property, unless there's some competing interest for the seller where the seller says, I don't want to do that for some reason. And I think what you see nowadays is there is a small percentage of instances where people have a reason not to put it on the MLS, such as they may be sick, they may be old, they may want to keep the sale confidential, but it's a very small percentage. And instead, what Jim was talking about is you have more of a market or industry phenomenon where more and more agents are keeping properties off the MLS without that same reason.
Exactly. Now that said, what Tony was speaking about is if I'm a listing agent, and that it would be a seller's realtor or a seller's agent, and I am charged with selling that house, typically in the old days, and I still do it, is I help the family get the house ready for sale, which may take weeks or a month. Then I put a sign on the lawn, and I have a broker tour during the week, an open house for brokers, and I have an open house Saturday and Sunday, and then I have advertising and marketing, and I'm helping the family, and then pretty soon we have offers and we negotiate, and we're weeks into this process, maybe a couple of months, and then we have a sale, and then we close a month later. Now what's been happening is a lot of sellers now, we see the stats we'll get into in a minute, that's not taking place in a pocket listing.
That's true. I mean, what we're seeing today is a huge volume of properties that are hitting the market with a close of escrow date that's 5 days, 10 days, not actually practical that something sold quite that quickly. So that they are being pre-marketed and sold outside of the MLS and then added to the MLS for comps and appraisal purposes later on.
Right, and so again, for the lay people in the audience, so that means that the seller did not traditionally hire the agent and put a sign on the lawn and put it on the multiple listing service and things like that. So you put together, your organization put together in 2011, 2.5 billion homes were off MLS.
Right.
2012, 3.4 billion homes were off MLS. And then 2013, 4.8 billion homes were off MLS.
$1 billion worth of transactions occurred
right.
outside of the MLS.
Outside of the MLS. So Tony, this some of the stats that they had when they first started tracking this, and this of course is when the market picked up. We didn't have this issue when we had 18,000 homes for sale in 2008. But as soon as the inventory shrunk, for some reason, this pocket listing phenomenon just took off the other direction.
And I think there's two competing reasons for that. One is I think there's an element for the real estate agents where they realize that they may be able to be a dual agent where they represent both the buyer and the seller in those transactions. It's commonly referred to as double ending a deal, where instead of getting half the commission, they'll get the full commission. So there's an element of greed that goes to it to some extent. And I think the other competing issue that goes with it is when there's a lower number of listings and there's less transactions on the table to be had, sometimes you see agents breach their fiduciary duty to try to get the best price for a client and instead are more worried about how much money they can make on a deal because there's fewer and fewer transactions available in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Now that is back to your stats about the difference between on MLS and off MLS, and you ran the numbers comparing it with the county courthouse and the county records, and for your 5 counties that you cover, the delta was 100,000 in favor of having the property fully marketed on the multiple listing service.
I mean, that's true. I mean, the exposure is unbelievable when the property is advertised inside the MLS, because in a multiple listing service, the participants cooperate with each other and agree to compensate each other to sell each other's listings. And a product hits the MLS, and you're going to get maximum exposure. You're going to, in our case, we have 16,000 subscribers that see the listings in the MLS, and then we're in a reciprocal with the other multiple listing services in Northern California. So there's another 50,000 realtors that have access to that property. And then there's all these advertising opportunities to take your listing and push it out to the portals on the internet for it to be advertised on those portals on the internet. And then we're also in a reciprocal arrangement with Southern California, so there's 120,000 agents that have access to your listing from Southern California. And keep in mind, these agents, these other participants in these other MLSs as well as ours, they have buyer clients looking for properties. Right. And so it's not a surprise to me that a property sells for a lot more money when it's advertised through the multiple listing service.
I think one way to explain it, as we were taught in law school, is that you can think of real property as a bundle of sticks. And when you go to sell a property, the agent has the duty to obtain the best offer or the best price. Mm-hmm. And it's commonly accepted, I think, that the standard of care is to put that property on the MLS because it's the biggest stick in the bundle, right? In that bundle of sticks you have putting it on the MLS for maximum exposure, putting it on the internet, putting up yard signs, putting up signs on the street corners, passing out cards going door to door. Those are all different sticks that agents use to market the property. Well, when you take out the biggest stick out of that, you take it off the MLS, it's hard to understand then how you're going to get the best price for it. So right. In order to meet your fiduciary obligation, there needs to be something very, very compelling where the seller is consenting or instructing you not to put it on the MLS. And like I said, I think that's usually a pretty small percentage.
That's a very small percentage. And you would know, you grew up in a real estate office, right? Your dad's a fine broker, and your sister, I've had a transaction with your sister.
And my wife as well. My whole family's involved in real estate.
So those barbecues are hard to get around with that jargon, real estate talk. But that, Tony's speaking about, there's always that small percentage of sellers who might be either wealthy or famous or have an ill family member or a lot of valuables in the property and perhaps don't want to put it on the market.
Well, that you always have that scenario.
You always have that.
But something to point out is 3 years ago we had maybe 2,400 listings excluded from the MLS, and last year there were 8,400
Right.
listings excluded from the MLS. And it just happens to be a lot less inventory than there was today. So it's just interesting that more people are concerned about privacy and security today than they were 2 or 3 years ago.
Okay, so of course you're being facetious because we look at the mount. It looked like Mount Everest, the inventory in 2008,
Right.
and everybody and their brother had the property with a sign on the lawn, open houses, on the multiple listing service, on the broker tour, on advertising and websites. And by the way, if we put a property for sale, which is called a listing, on the multiple listing service, your MLS, it auto-populates immediately, or can if you select the proper buttons, to 85 websites, and then it goes to hundreds more.
Yes,
Is that correct?
that's correct.
Okay, so as soon as the inventory started to subside and then we got real tight inventory, all of a sudden this phenomenon of off-MLS listings started to appear, and they call it pocket listing because the realtor has it in his pocket, nobody else knows about it, right? So that, of course, you just mentioned a couple of years ago there was 2,700 exclusion. Now let's talk about what is an exclusion, because I know agents agree that if you are a member of the multiple listing service and the board of realtors, state, local, national, you're supposed to put your listing, your property for sale, on the MLS and share it.
Right, you are. I mean, we're a mandatory submission multiple listing service, but the seller still has the right to say that he doesn't want his property in the multiple listing service. And maybe it's temporarily while he's getting it ready for sale, and maybe it's not at all. And in that case, the agent is supposed to submit to the MLS an exclusion form signed by the seller. But sellers should be really careful about signing those forms because they are severely limiting the exposure and the marketing of that property if they exclude it off the multiple listing service.
I mean, I can just tell you from the clients or prospective clients that come into my office, the stories they're telling are that the agent, they later find out that their house could have sold for $100,000 or $150,000 more. And I said, well, what did your agent tell you? Why wasn't it put on the MLS? And the clients say, well, the common stories are, the agent told me things like, you don't want somebody coming through your house, or you don't want people to know your business, or you don't want to have, maybe things stolen or taken out of here. And just like an attorney, a real estate agent is trusted. There's confidence placed in that in that agent, and consumers or sellers will defer to that knowledge or to that experience. And sometimes I think agents can lead a seller down the path where, yes, they signed the form that says they consented to it, but they weren't maybe given the full explanation of both sides and the pros and cons of keeping it on the MLS, which is why I think when the California Association of Realtors changed the listing agreement to have that specific information in there now, I think that's much more helpful to sellers because at least it's in black and white.
Right, and that's what the lead counsel of the California Association of Realtors mentioned at the national convention, is that conversation what you just mentioned about is not being taking place in full at the kitchen table.
Right.
About the full exposure. Now, by the way, how that attorney, she mentioned it is the seller has to refuse to put the listing on the multiple listing service. And they would have to have a good reason. Now let's speak about that privacy, because as your family knows, for years there's ways to limit access to the property. We have what we call lock boxes or key safes where a key to the front door is on the property. We can eliminate that or just put it out on certain times. We can eliminate a sign on the lawn. We can reduce the showings. We can make it by appointment only with the seller's realtor. We can limit, by the way, on your multiple listing service, since the internet came out, we can limit to having it only on the multiple listing service, correct?
Correct. Everybody has the option when they're uploading their listing to choose Internet No, and it never leaves the service. It stays in there only for other qualified real estate professionals to have access to.
Okay, so this issue is really two-part. One of my mentors used to say, agents don't know, they don't know. That this issue may be a wave. Some people feel there will be a wave of litigation a year or two or three down the road when sellers find out that perhaps the agent representing them was thinking about their bottom line instead of the sellers.
Yes, and from a liability perspective, there's a lot of things I think many agents don't know. There's the disciplinary type liability, whether it's with the Bureau of Real Estate or with MLS for not following the rules or the ethics or the codes that you've signed. Then there's also civil liability, which is the seller retains a lawyer, and the lawyer advises them to file a lawsuit for whatever damages you had, which are essentially the diminution in value or the lesser amount that the lesser amount of money that you obtained. Mm-hmm. And in those are claims for breach of fiduciary duty and negligence and constructive fraud. I think in a lot of the instances that I see, the people that are misled, the sellers that are misled, are older. And if they're over 65, then the agent may also be subject to financial elder abuse claims, which are also fairly punitive. But I think at a more global level, there's also just the impact of the public confidence in real estate agents and the real estate industry, where you have a certain number of actors that are causing a tremendous decrease in confidence for the rest of the industry.
Right. Now, you brought up a good point, and Jim, you mentioned about this in-house before the show. A pocket listing, typically now, when I'm a broker, I put a house for sale, I put a sign on the lawn, I have it on the multiple listing. I'm not going to represent the buyer. In fact, as company policy, we don't represent the buyer. We want the buyer to have their own representation, work with another brokerage and another realtor. And now, dual agency, we'll have Tony speak about what is dual agency. I understand that it's not legal in some states. Dual agency.
Yes, in California, dual agency is legal, and what dual agency means is the same broker, not the same agent, but the same broker represents both the buyer and the seller in a transaction. And there's different levels of that. You may have a big brokerage company that's statewide, where the agents don't know each other or never met, where it's technically still a dual agency transaction, but it's not the kind we're talking about, to the other extreme where you have the same individual agent represent both the buyer and the seller. Mm-hmm. And under California law, this is allowed as long as the agent meets their fiduciary obligation to both sides. Some people in other states have questioned that logic, because if your fiduciary duty to the seller is to get the highest price, and your fiduciary duty to the buyer is to get the lowest price, somewhat counterintuitive how you can meet both those obligations simultaneously. Right.
And we, of course, I'm with the director here, Ryan Kapowich. We've been doing shows for 15 years, over 200 shows, and dual agency keeps popping up that it's problematic. And one of the reasons it's problematic is the real estate attorneys tell us that 80 to 90% of the lawsuits in California, it's a buyer going after a seller.
Yes, that's true. Okay.
So dual agency makes that situation even worse, because now the seller has a target on their back saying, hey, your agent that you hired didn't represent me properly, the buyer.
Right.
Right.
And I can only speak anecdotally, but my experience is certainly that dual agent transactions seem to end up in litigation more often than when each buyer and seller have their own agent.
Okay, that's fair assessment. Now, with that's a problem. I don't think we're addressing that as often, because with this pocket listings, what that means is that the agent themselves has the listing, the home for sale, in his pocket, and he or she will get on the phone and drum up a buyer and represent the buyer and the seller, one realtor, one agent.
Well, we are seeing our stats increase on double-ended deals.
Right.
Where the selling agent and the buyer agent are the same person.
And I think the reduced level of inventory feeds into that as well.
Correct. So that's more the greed factor, that the agent, since it has fewer paychecks per year, then the agent says, well, I can get 2 paychecks with less than 10 hours work.
And the other part of it is right now, most productive agents have lots of buyers looking for property, and listings are like gold. So if you get a listing, most productive agents have people that are already willing to buy that property in the first place.
Okay, Tony, also mention this, and Jim, I know you noticed this here, and that may be another status. The dual agency, it's not just the individual, the man or woman, it's the firm, correct?
Correct. It goes, you look at the broker level.
Okay. So that's another stat. How many, because brokers and offices, this is a big problem or an easy problem to have because they have sales meetings once a week. And in these sales meetings at a real estate office, people say wants and needs. And agents will speak up. I have a family that wants a 4-bedroom house with Brown and Kaufman, and another realtor will speak, I want a condominium close to the expressway. And then another realtor say, I have a listing coming up next to the expressway, right? So we have this in-house conversation taking place where the one realtor or agent might sell to their coworker, and that's still dual agency in-house. Jim, are you working on stats about how many are the same agent as opposed to in-office? Or?
We are. I don't have them yet, but we
Okay.
are working on stats regarding transactions within the same office.
Okay.
I think at the end of the day, this is the simple analogy or explanation for this, which is it's okay for those offices or those brokerage companies to pitch those listings in-house,
Sure,
as long as they're also on the multiple listing service. Because the truth is that if you put it on the multiple listing service, then the agent in your office can also make an offer. But if you only talk about it in your office, then agents for other brokerage companies cannot make offers on it because they don't know about it if it's not on the MLS. So the short answer I think sellers need to understand is that if it goes on the MLS, every licensed agent can see it. And
Right.
that's how you drive up the best, that's how you get the best price.
right. And of course with these websites, Jim, you had mentioned before the show, I know if I click the proper buttons when I put a listing, a home for sale, on your website as a realtor, a licensed agent, that it automatically goes to 85 websites.
It does if you pick that.
If I check those boxes, and then it individually goes to all the other
All the
companies,
brokers and agents' websites.
brokers and agents' websites. So I'm really getting exposure.
Right.
For instance, last weekend I had almost 300 people through open houses, 10 hours of open houses. That would not have happened if
No.
I had it off MLS.
Well, plus we have automated prospecting systems in the multiple listing service too. So when you put your listing in the service or you change it, everybody gets an email that's watching for properties like your property,
Okay.
letting you know that this just got added. So you're getting alerts and messages, and you might have set your clients up to receive automated emails when properties of certain characteristics hit the market, and so it's just a multiple of exposure. I mean, there's absolutely no way you're getting the best price for your seller by exposing that listing to a smaller marketplace. The multiple listing service is not just a distribution utility, but a huge marketing tool for all its
It is a
subscribers.
marketing. And for risk management, if a realtor or an agent puts a listing of home for sale on a multiple listing service, that lead counsel mentioned, this is a good way to make sure, insulate yourself for liability. You did what you could to get top dollar and exposure for that seller.
Right. I mean, what agents are measured at for in a liability context is whether or not they met the standard of care for a reasonably objective agent and how they would sell that
right.
property. And I think it's commonly accepted that putting it on the MLS is how you best meet that obligation. The other thing I'd like to talk about that Jim mentioned is we also have sophisticated buyers who are using social networking and the internet, and they're looking, you may have a buyer that's looking for a very specific area, and they've hired you as a real estate agent to look in that area, and then all of a sudden they find out that something just came on MLS and is already listed as sold. Why didn't you find that for them? Why didn't they have a chance to buy that property? And that's what I mentioned in terms of the public confidence of it is you have buyers then looking sideways at their own agent saying, well, why didn't you know about this? And the agents are now put in this position where they have to explain to buyers, well, a third of the listings are done off the MLS and I don't have access to that.
Mm-hmm. The other issue, little flip side of that, is sellers. When I'm holding an open house, buyers often come to me and say, I would like you to represent me to buy this house. So the buyers are coming directly to the listing agent on the open house saying, would you please represent me? And when I mine down and talk to them, say, well, why would I do that? And they say, well, you get twice the brokerage fee if you represent me. So those buyers are appealing to the seller's agent, to the greed factor. So I would just as note for the sellers out there, probably not a good idea to have your seller's agent represent both the buyer and seller.
Right.
A little insulation there. Let's finish up here. We got a few more minutes here on these private listing groups that started, 2010, 2011?
Yeah, fairly recently.
Okay, a private listing group is supposedly the top 10% agents in an area, and they will only have the listings among themselves.
Well, so there's one that only takes the top 10, but they have to prove they're the top 10 by providing their marketing stats out of the MLS system. So it's kind of interesting. And then there's another one that is fairly exclusive where you can apply to see if you can join, and I don't know what the decision process is on who they let in and who they don't, but we call these MLS clubs, and they're really defined by California law as a multiple listing service. An MLS club is.
And I know that the problem there is the fair housing and antitrust, where they might collude on brokerage fees and or just by nature, certain races and whatnot might not have access to that elite group of agents in that neighborhood.
Yeah, so I don't know how they make their decision on who they let into their clubs.
So in fact, what the council mentioned, she did get an email of one of the leaders of a group saying, remember, do not put your listing on the MLS, and remember, the minimum brokerage fees is XYZ. So just right there, looking for some trouble. So I do want to mention before we leave here, though, but the stats that you put together here in 2011, 12% of the listings were off MLS. Then 2012, almost 15% were off. In 2013, we had almost 21% of the listings off the MLS, in the tightest inventory of my career.
So the tighter the inventory gets, the more off MLS transactions are occurring. The more private, the more double-sided transactions are happening.
So I think for the point for the sellers, that is, the inventory gets tight, there's fewer paychecks. These agents would like to have 2 paychecks on their listing.
Well, and as I understand it, it's not only just the 20% that are never on the MLS, and there's another percentage that are put on very late in the game.
There's a large percentage of listings, like 16% of the listings that hit the market with 10 days on market or something, and that's really impossible.
Or 10 hours, they already sold and put it on.
Yeah, they've already been sold.
Gentlemen, thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks again for watching Kapowich on Real Estate. This is a program dedicated to consumer protection within the residential real estate arena. Remember to watch for those pocket listing, off MLS, and dual agency. We will see you next week. Take care.